Dr. Stephanie Wright. She is an author and a blogger. She blogs and writes about education and interpersonal violence, as well as various cultural themes on both her own blog and at the World Class Blog Review. In addition to the craft of writing, at the core of all she does, she is a social psychologist with a focus in attribution theory and legal issues. Her undergraduate work was completed at the illustrious High Point University in North Carolina. She was fortunate to work with Jim Lukenbuehl and Kitty Klein at North Carolina State University, where she completed her master's and PhD. Currently, she teaches at Georgia Highlands College in the foothills of the Appalachians. Let's learn more about Dr. Wright and her views on cosmopolitanism.
So I'm going to be asking you some questions about cosmopolitanism and your views as a cosmopolitan.
Great.
My first question is, do you consider cosmopolitanism a worldview, a lifestyle, a geographic accident, or something else?
I suppose that I would consider cosmopolitanism a bit of all of these. So I think one can accidentally be born into cosmopolitanism, but one doesn't have to be born into cosmopolitanism. So you can be born rurally or suburban and still grow into that worldview. I think that one must have a cosmopolitan worldview in order to be considered a cosmopolitan.
Great. How have your life experiences led you to a cosmopolitan philosophy of life?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, although I have predominantly been raised inside of suburban homes, we have always been adjacent to major metropolitan areas, and I spent a good deal of time being exposed to cosmopolitan philosophies and ideologies, and then also I think the importance of gaining as much education as possible shaped that as well, because clearly more education lends a more cosmopolitan worldview.
How does your work in social psychology lend itself to being cosmopolitan?
So I think that psychology itself looks at the study of human affect, behavior, and cognition. Social psychology, looking at the individual within psychology or within society, and social psychology particularly being that place that cradles cross-culturalism. And so if there's ever a place in psychology where we look at things from a cosmopolitan worldview, it would be social psychology. And so since I chose that as my field, we sort of always look to our answers for phenomena with a cross-cultural perspective.
How does your teaching, since you're a professor, reflect cosmopolitanism, and also do you intend to reflect cosmopolitanism in your teaching?
I think I always intend to do that. Whether I always do that successfully or not is up for debate, but I always intend to do it. And as for how, I try and always put a case study spin on my teaching. So I am not a lecture-only teacher, and I try and incorporate multiple worldviews so that students come away with something that enriches their own experiences. Everybody brings their own experiences to class, but by using the pedagogy that I use, hopefully everybody walks away with a little bit broader perspective.
So, in the book Cosmopolitanism by Kwame Appiah, he says, we can live together without agreeing on what the values are that make it good to live together. We can agree about what to do in most cases without agreeing about why it is right. Do you agree with this claim, and does it reflect your cosmopolitan beliefs? Mainly the part about we don't have to agree about why something is right to agree that it is right.
Um, I think so, yes. In part, I think that we all operate at the core by a set of evolutionary principles that most people don't understand. And yet to abide by those principles gets us further as a society than operating contrary to those principles. So we don't have to understand why we do things that are quote unquote right. Um, And yet at the same time, they always are.
And one last question. Appiah also said conversation doesn't have to lead to consensus about anything, especially not values. It's enough that it helps people get used to one another. Why do you think it is important for us as humans to quote unquote get used to one another?
I think that we don't we don't all have the same cultural values. But if you understand human morality, then you understand that at its highest level, we all have the same sort of universal principles. And so as we continue to get used to one another, we come ever closer to those principles and to realizing them.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time.